After I had made my Mrs Maisel inspired swimsuit using Simplicity pattern 8139, I started work on view B, the matching beach coat. I really loved the look of the version on the pattern envelope with the white outer and matching lining, so I decided to use my leftover striped cotton for my lining and a plain white cotton poplin for my fashion fabric. I started by matching the stripes of my lining fabric to keep everything bang on grain, and then cut the pieces. The sleeves of the beach coat are grown on, so the pattern pieces are big. I used pins to mark which pieces were the front and which the back, because they looked so similar, and carried on cutting. For the pockets, I made sure to get the stripe placement identical. I then cut the front and back pieces again in the main white fabric. I used a tracing wheel without any carbon paper to transfer the darts to the white fabric, as I didn't want it to stain. But for the striped lining fabric, I used yellow carbon paper, just as I had for the swimsuit. I stitched in the darts, matching the small circles and following my traced lines, remembering not to reverse but to leave long threads at the point. The lining is made up in almost exactly the same way as the main, so I had to repeat every step twice. Next, I moved on to stay stitching the neckline. I've been spending my time in lockdown making scrubs for local hospitals, so I've gotten really into batch sewing things in a continuous line like this. I then cut them apart and trim the threads. Then I went back and tied off all the threads I had left at the darts to stop the stitching coming undone. I then joined the centre-back seams of the lining and the main. To make up the pockets, I pinned 2 layers of the striped cotton together with right sides together, taking care to match the stripes. I then stitched around the edge of the pocket, pivoting at the corners and leaving an opening so that I could turn the pocket through. I then took everything I had done to the ironing board to catch up on my pressing. First, I pressed the darts in over a tailor's ham. Then I pressed the centre-back seams, first flat and then open. For the pockets, I trimmed down the seam allowance at the corners and notched the curved edge. I then turned them right side out and carefully rolled the seam allowances between my fingers to get a sharp edge, which then got pressed in place. For the curved edge, I was able to roll the seams as I pressed. Then for the open edge, I folded the seam allowances neatly under and pressed them in place. Of course, I repeated all this for the other pocket. I slip stitched the openings shut by hand before using my top stitching foot to top stitch the section of the pocket which wouldn't get sewn down to the coat. I'd used my tracing wheel to transfer the location of the pockets, so I lined up the pocket patches with the markings and pinned them in place, making sure to leave the opening for my hand free. Here you can just see that pinwheel line that I am using as a guide. Once again with my top stitching foot, I stitched around the edges of the pocket to secure them in place, matching up the stitching line with that line of top stitching I had done on the pocket before. Now I could start constructing the coat. I started with the long shoulder and top arm seams, matching the balance marks and pinning in place. I then stitched them together and repeated for the lining. I took both the main and lining to the ironing board and pressed these seams open, changing the position of the coat to accommodate the angle of the neck. Then I pinned together the long continuous side seam and underarm seams. Sewing these took some careful machining around the tight curve of the underarm for both the main and the lining. At this point I realised I hadn't left an opening in the centre back seam of the lining to bag the coat out, so I fixed that by adding some reverse stitches to the seam and unpicking the stitching in between them. To get the underarm curves to lie flat, I had to snip into them in several places. I then pressed the side seam open using the nose of the iron to press the curves. I had to use my sleeve board to press the underarm sections and to get the rest of the curve. And then I did this all again for the lining. It was then time to join the lining to the main. With right sides together, I matched up all the seams at the neck and pinned the two curved edges together. I also matched the side and back seams together to pin the bottom edge in place. Then I matched the centre fronts. To join the two together, I machined all the way around the outside edge of the coat, pivoting at the corners. Once that was all stitched up, I took the coat to the ironing board and pressed the edges, grading the corners to reduce bulk. I fold up the seam allowances to see how much I need to cut off. And then fold them once again to check they will lie nicely when turned through. I also grade the seam allowances at the side and back seams to reduce bulk. I grade all the seams at the neck edge and then notch the curve all the way around. Now for the fun bit. I turned the coat right side out through the opening in the lining. I find that, a bit like when changing a duvet cover, it's best to do the corners first and then everything else kind of works itself into place. Once the coat is right sides out, I begin rolling the seams so that I can press them in a crisp edge all the way around. I took my time doing this as there is no understitching on this pattern. To finish the sleeve cuffs, I had to do that tricky bagging out thing. I pinned them together from the right side and then pulled the lining sleeve out through the opening in the lining. I then pinned the lining sleeve inside the main sleeve with right sides together. To do this, I had to turn back the edge of the sleeve lining like this. I then matched the top arm seam and then the underarm. I continued pinning between the seams and ended up with this tube-like thing of one continuous sleeve. To sew it, you have to carefully keep the rest of the sleeves out of the way and keep adjusting the angle of the fabric under the machine. This is tricky to explain and tricky to do, so I hope the video demonstrates it better than I have. I must admit, I really dislike this method of finishing sleeves. I'd rather just slip stitch the lining in place, but I like to practice different techniques to keep my skills sharp. Then this one continuous sleeve gets pushed back through the opening in the lining and worked into its final position. Of course, this then also gets a press. Only this time, rather than aiming to have the seam right on the edge of the cuff, I am rolling the lining to the outside slightly, as these cuffs will be worn turned back. This should stop there being a band of white being visible around the top of the cuff. Once pressed, I turn the cuffs up to the desired width and then iron them gently in place. I repeat all of this for the other sleeve, and then I can close up that opening in the lining. I did this by hand with a slip stitch. The pinwheel marks for the buttonhole had disappeared when pressing, so I had to quickly get the pattern out and mark it in again. Then I set up my machine for a buttonhole and began stitching. While at the machine, I also then made up the belt. I did this by folding it in half lengthways and sewing a narrow seam around the edges. I left a small gap to be able to turn the belt right side out. At the ironing board, I graded the seam allowance to reduce bulk at the corners and then began the long process of turning the belt right side out. To get crisp corners, I roll the fabric between my fingers and wiggle it into position. Next, I had to press the belt. Again, I rolled the seam to get it right on the edge and pressed in place. Then I put pins in the end of my buttonhole, so I couldn't cut too far, and cut it open. I don't usually cut buttonholes with scissors, but I've lost my buttonhole chisel. The buttonhole ended up being too small for the only vaguely appropriate button I had in my stash, so I decided to do without one until I can go out and buy one the right size. The very last step was to close up the opening in the belt. This I did quickly with a ladder stitch, and then the beach coat was complete. I put my matching swimsuit on and went back into the garden for a little photo shoot. You'll have to forgive the fact I look really moody here. This was a very low energy day for me and I was really struggling to get into the right frame of mind for filming. But I was eventually able to work up a smile by goofing around a little bit. I am really pleased with the finished beach coat. I feel that it takes this outfit out of that cutesy pin-up look and makes it seem more sophisticated, and to be honest, that's a lot more my style. I really love that swing shape that it's got when worn open, but I also like the way it looks when belted shut. The only thing that bothers me is that the belt isn't attached in any way to the coat, and if you're as good at losing things as I am, you'll understand why that's a problem. Thankfully there is a pocket to keep the belt in, but I think when I get around to sewing on that button, I will add some belt loops as well. Overall, I'm so pleased with this project. It turned out just how I imagined it, and I can't wait to take a trip to the beach to test it out. Thanks for watching. See you next time.